Anime on location, and we are here at Colossalcon 2013 with Walter Simonson.
How you doing?
Pretty good. How'd you first get into the world of comics?
I went to college initially as a geology major with an interest in dinosaurs and becoming a paleontologist. At the end of my senior year, I decided that was not what I was going to do. But while I was in college, it was in the mid-'60s, Marvel Comics, the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Don Heck, all that stuff was coming out. I'd gotten into reading them while I was in college. After I graduated, I wasn't sure what to do. I'd always loved drawing. I'd never thought about drawing as a career. My dad was a scientist. My brother became a scientist and a teacher. So I didn't know anybody who did freelance work. But I eventually decided to go to art school because I didn't know what else I could do. While I was in art school, I kind of quit reading as many comics, but I got really interested in telling stories and drawing them. So by the time I graduated, I had done a comic book, about a 50-page comic over 2 years as a degree project, and the second half of it, which was not bad, became my portfolio, and I took it to New York to try and get work.
Building upon that, can you tell us about your first project, the Star Slammers?
That was it. That was my degree project. I was a science fiction fan back in the day. I read a lot of science fiction. I haven't read so much recently. I haven't read a lot, hardly any recently. But I read a lot back in the 60s and 70s. All the classics, Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein. And I was a big Zelazny fan, little newer guys, back when there was a science fiction new wave. Excuse me. So when I came out of I grew up near Washington, D.C. And kind of between college and art school, I ended up living at home for a while, joined a science fiction club, the Washington Science Fiction Association, WSFA for short, became a member, hung out there. WSFA was working on a bid to hold the World Science Fiction Convention in 1974 in Washington. And I was there 70, 71. Bids are done some years in advance. And I became part of the group trying to promote that idea. And to that end, I did what I could do. I invented a comic book that was going to promote DC in 74, one way or another, really pulp science fiction. That evolved into the Star Slammers. So when I was at art school, I was working on this Star Slammers project that began as a WSFA promotional tool, and it morphed into a junior year project and then into my senior thesis. So I did it. It came out really as early ash cans given away on freebie tables at science fiction conventions. So it was published in really terrible printed form, and it also became my portfolio. Altogether, it was a comic that I wrote, penciled, lettered, and inked, pretty much in that order. And the second half was sort of professional grade or close enough for rock and roll. So I took it to New York when I graduated in 72. I bound up the second half, took it to New York, and that was my portfolio. So the Slammers, it was really a group of space mercenaries who went around and took names and kicked ass.
Sounds a lot like Starship Troopers, almost.
I like the Starship Troopers. There was actually another book which author Gordon Dixon, I believe that's right, Gordon Dixon, wrote a series of books about, or some books about the Dorsai, D-O-R-S-A-I, which were also space mercenaries, more mercenaries than troopers. I read one or two of those. I don't know how influential they were. I mean, it was just all the science fiction stuff at the time. The only thing I really remember clearly now is that I saw a paperback somewhere with the name Gunslammer as the title. I thought that was very cool. So for me, they became the Space Slammers. And then somewhere in there I said, I kind of like Star better. So I changed it to Star Slammers. And this is about 1970. And they kind of grew. The initial Star Slammers, Space Slammers, I did 2 pages that were really heavily Robert Crumb and Vaughn Bodie influenced. That was originally kind of an underground look. I kind of peeled away from that very rapidly, but that's kind of how it started.
What were some of your favorite comic series that you have worked on over the years and contributed to?
The ones that I guess I would pick a few highlights. I did a strip called Manhunter back in the early 70s. Archie Goodwin wrote it. He created the idea. I designed the costume. We did it in the back of Detective Comics. And it won some awards, but it's also the work that kind of broke me professionally in that I began doing comics, just as a new guy in 72. By 73, I was working on Manhunter, and by the time that strip was over about a year later, I was well known. The editors all knew who I was. This is kind of before Phantom as we have it now, but editors knew who I was, and that it made me professional, made me a made man professionally. I'm a big Thor fan. I like doing the Metal Men. I did a book called Orion, which was based on the New Gods for DC about 10 years ago. I did a book with heavy metal with Archie Goodwin. It was an adaptation of the movie Alien. And we had a lot of reference, we had a lot of help from the movie company on that. And as a result, I thought it turned out quite well. And so that was that project was a real joy to work on. So that was a high point for me. After Orion's about 2000, and then a couple of years ago, actually over several years, I worked on a graphic novel for DC called The Judas Coin. And that came out about a year ago. It's a series of short stories that are strung together thematically with different, mostly fairly unknown DC characters. Were 6 short stories. I tried to draw each story in a different style, which was kind of fun. I don't know how successful I was, but it was enjoyable. And that worked out very well. Laverne Kondrasky did the coloring, and Laverne did a beautiful job with it, so I was very happy with the way the book looked. And then since then, I'm no longer under contract as I was for a long time. So I've tried to work with guys that are writers that I have not had a chance to work with under contract. So I work with Brian Bendis, with Mark Waid. Mark and I just did a Hulk story, a 3-issue Hulk story, and we got to kind of go back in time and use Thor the way he was back when I was drawing him, and that was a treat. We just had a good time on that. It was a lot of fun. The Avenger Brian was fun. So I've been very lucky in the stuff I'm doing, and that's, those would be pretty high points. I'm sorry to all the folks I forgot to list your name and your comics, but it's been good so far.
And throughout all of that time and throughout all of the work you've done, how do you feel the comic industry has changed and morphed?
Well, the business model of comics has changed a great deal in the time I've been doing comics, for mainstream comics. I mean, setting aside all the stuff on the web, the web comics that are available, digital comics that are available, none of that stuff was around in 1972. The web wasn't around back then. So all of that stuff is different. There are a lot of independent comics now. Back when I was starting off, Marvel and DC were the only companies doing the kind of comics I wanted to do, the adventure comics, superhero comics. There were things like the Disney comics, the Duck characters, Richie Rich and Archie. Oh, Archie's been around, still around. But so there were a lot of those guys. Some of those companies aren't around anymore. Some still are. Archie still is. But basically, it was all print, and it was all out of New York City, essentially. Now, not only are there a host of independent companies like IDW and Dark Horse that do work, Image, which is pretty big, has done work. Marvel and DC are still there. But when I was a kid reading comics in the 50s, there were a lot of genres of comics. So I only read superheroes, but there were westerns, there were adaptations of movies, there were, Sea Hunt television shows, there were classics illustrated, there were history of the FBI, all sorts of stuff. And I read everything. I didn't read romance comics. I remember racing car comics. I guess I don't know when NASCAR started, but they were basically NASCAR type comics. And I just consumed everything. I loved it all. By the time I was getting into comics in the early 70s, it was kind of superheroes and other stuff that were gradually fading, war comics. And then some years ago, it was kind of superhero comics. The opening up of the web and the opening up of a lot of independent companies, Karen Berger's work at DC with Vertigo, really kind of recreated a whole host of genres that I don't think have been around as much for a long time, which means there's a lot wider range of stuff to read if you're a fan. You can really find a lot of stuff. You can go on the web, online, and find lots of stuff. And even the business models of the main companies like Marvel and DC have changed. When I was doing Thor in the mid-'80s, you did an issue, it came out, that was really it. There were comic shops where you could buy back issues, but for the most part, the work came out and evaporated. Now, almost everything is geared to be reprinted. Stories there are now 65 and 6-issue story arcs from Marvel and DC. There are crossovers all the time. The idea that they'll all be in print and hardcover or soft cover. When I did Thor, 1983, 84, 85, 86, it never crossed my mind that 30 years later, Marvel would put out a 1,200-page book of all of my Thors in one unit. That's pretty cool. It was kind of neat. And they recolored, remastered it, did a lot of work on it. It was great. But it's a very different idea of what you do with the intellectual property that the companies have created. And they're still working that out. I'm not too sure where digital comics are going to go from mainstream yet. I think the business models there are still being sorted out, and I have no idea. But those things are available in a way that was never available before. I've got guys who read my stuff online, but not in a floppy, or guys who don't buy the floppies because they're waiting for the hardcovers, the soft covers to come out. And that makes a big difference. It changes the way stories are structured. It changes the way comics are written. In some ways, I think comics have changed the way that they have been drawn. Partly, I think, well, do one more thing and we can wrap that part up, is that the comics of, when I was doing comics on Thor and before that, were comics, I think, were based on written models, which is to say, they came out of the old pulp magazines and the pulp books of the 30s, 20s, and 30s and 40s. So they were a reading medium at the time. Somewhere in the last 20 years, the paradigm for comics has become movies. A lot of the guys who do comics want to do movies. A lot of the guys who write them have done movies. Movies are, well, they're different from the old pulps. They're much more visual, a lot less writing. And so what I think you've gotten in a lot of comics, not every comic, but a lot of comics, is a model that has far fewer words, that has far fewer graphic devices like sound effects, thought balloons, a lot of things that have kind of been winnowed away from a lot of mainstream comics because the paradigm has shifted from written material to visual material. That's still happening. I'm not sure it's all going to go. It's interesting, but I think it is different, and I think it's significant in the way the comics are produced, the way they look, and the way they read now.
All right. Have you been enjoying these many comic books that have been adapted into films recently, now that we've just discussed how films have been affecting comics and how they've been structured?
I probably haven't read many of the visual adaptations. The thing about that is that comic book adaptations of movies have changed over the past 30 years in that 30 or 40 years ago, if I may say, I don't think movie companies mostly cared what happened to the comics. That was just one more way to make a few bucks, and it wasn't important to the movie at all. Now, because the intellectual property rights are so different from what they used to be, and because there's so many more fingers in the pies, as it were, in the intellectual property, it'd be hard to do a comic, for example, without having the likeness right approvals. Exactly, and with the with likeness rights of actors and actresses that are in the book, in the comics. I know that even years ago, one of my friends did an adaptation of a movie. This is like 20 years ago or more, and he was told not to put certain stuff in the comic book, some significant scenes from the movie, because they didn't want to reveal it before the movie came out. Now, I'm not sure the comic came out beforehand, but that was the way it was. They didn't want any leaks on it. They didn't want anything to happen. So he had to kind of write around some very significant scenes in the movie, which makes the comic a little weirder as far as a reading experience goes. The comic book adaptations that I did from movies, Raiders of the Lost Ark I wrote, Jurassic Park I wrote, Alien I drew. That was long enough ago that those considerations weren't around. The difficulty for me with the more recent considerations simply is that a lot of your creative energy is now spent, I think, getting likeness rights approved, or working around the script things that you can't do, stuff like that. If your creative energy is concentrated there, it's not so concentrated on just telling a good comic, a good story in a good comic. And so I don't think I'd be doing a lot of movie stuff at this point. It just wouldn't be worth it. There are too many other factors involved rather than just doing the comic. Whereas the ones that I did at the time I was doing them, we could just do the comic. So I preferred that. I haven't read a lot of the movie adaptations that are out now, the ones that do come out. I know what some of those guys go through trying to get that stuff put out, which is interesting and very challenging, but not my main interest in reading one of those stories is not how much this guy looks like that actor. I'm not so concerned about that.
Do these movies, do they help the comic industry or do they hinder it? How do you feel?
Boy, I have no idea. I can't imagine it's not good to have all that free advertising out there for your comic book. So that just seems, I mean, it would depend. It would help if the movies are good. The recent run of Marvel movies I thought have been a lot of fun. I haven't seen Iron Man 3 yet, but I loved, Thor was fun. I thought the Avengers was great. I've really enjoyed the films a lot. So it's hard to imagine that's not a benefit for the comics. If the movie's really awful, well, I don't, I know they say that it doesn't matter what they say about you as long as you spell your name right in the PR. I don't know if that's true or not, but certainly a lot of the properties that the comics have created are much better known as properties than they were. I mean, Thor as a character from Marvel, 20, 30 years ago, comic fans would have known about him. Now, a lot of people who aren't comic fans know about him. Whether they go into comic shops and buy comics or not, or even know there are comics of the character, I'm not sure. But I can't imagine it would hurt the comics, really, other than if the companies decide they want the comics to mirror the movies a bit more and begin putting brakes on some of the creative things you would do in a comic because it won't be what the movies are about. And from my point of view, that would be less interesting as a property to work on. But whether that's actually happening, I don't know.
Now, it has been several years since you've been here to Colossalcon. How have you enjoyed the trip? How have you enjoyed seeing all these people walking through the halls and conversing with them? And
I love cosplay. I think it's great. I'm wearing as much cosplay now as I'm ever going to wear. I wear a shirt of my own drawing. Here's my shirt. That's my own drawing. That's all I do. So I don't do much else this way. But I think the costumes are phenomenal. I've seen some phenomenal costumes. I mean, even over years, I've seen, you see costumes of professional grade walking around. But I just love seeing all of it. I saw a little while back before we were doing this, a young woman went by. I love being old enough to say a young woman now, but so it was a young mom going by, and she had her daughter, and the daughter was maybe so high. So I don't know whether, maybe 4, I don't think 5, I don't think that old. And they were both in costume. Well, that was one of the neatest things I've seen. I've seen it before, but that was just really cool. So I love that stuff. We just ate at a little restaurant, just at the fast food place up the street. When we were there, 3 or 4 girls came in. I mean, like teenagers in there. One had an extremely elaborate cosplay. I don't know anime and manga, so I couldn't tell you who the characters were. That was kind of a princess type outfit. It was a big pink thing with lots of cloth around the outside. There were a couple other girls, horns and different color and all sorts of stuff. And their dad, or maybe their granddad, I wasn't sure, who was completely straight, white hair and completely straight. And I sort of loved the idea. He was sitting there at this dinner at the table in the restaurant with these 4 girls in their cosplay outfits. I thought that was fantastic. So I really enjoyed it. I love watching people walk by and all their stuff. I mean, I lived in New York for a while. One of my favorite things in New York, it's like people watching. You go out and you eat at one of the sidewalk restaurants this summer. You sit there and just watch all the people go by. And the people here are at least as interesting and possibly more interesting than the people who walk by on the street in New York. So it's very cool. As far as, it's been probably 10 years since I was here. I was at the first 3 Colossalcons, and then they kind of peeled away from comics and went off to, in fact, when they called me up about this, I said, are you sure you want us here? Because really, we're like comic book guys. I know what Colossalcon's about. But they said, sure. So, and I'm delighted to see the size of it. I'm delighted by the variety I see here. I'm stunned to discover there are that many people in Northern Ohio, but I think it's great. I think it's fantastic. Seems to be doing well and growing every year. They seem to think they're doing better this year than last year, and particularly over the past few years of not the world's greatest economics. I'm delighted that the convention's been growing. So it's very cool to be, and it's nice to be here. It's fun just hanging out. I don't go to very many conventions. I'm not a big traveling guy. I just like staying home mostly. So, but once in a while it's nice to get out, and I would kind of like a little warmer weather, because it's like that where we live. It's been a little cool, and especially some of the costumes I see walking around out in the park and going, boy, how's that working out for you? Because I know I'm wearing a shirt.
I think there was a lot of people that were expecting it to be a bit warmer.
A little, just a tad warmer, But it's okay, but it's been a lot of fun. I love it. We have wondered how some of the characters with long tails get through that being stepped on as they go through some of the incredibly heavy crowds that have walked by, but it's been great.
Are there any...
I'll jump one more thing. It also seems to have been, at least from our point of view, very well organized, which is one of those things you kind of, especially when you're a guest, you kind of watch for at a con. But they seem to have done a very good job of organizing it, at least for us and how things have played out. So we're very pleased.
Yeah, I can say for press, it's been pretty efficient for us too. Good. Yeah. Are there any current or upcoming projects that you're capable of discussing with us?
There are, but I'm not capable. What I will say is, I just finished a 3-issue arc on the Hulk. That was with Mark Waid from Marvel. Last issue came out about 2 weeks ago. Please go buy it. Make my day. And it will also, I think it's coming out in a trade paperback. It'll be part of the collection with another artist. It was a lot of fun to do. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm actually lining up right now to do a creator-owned book, which is really why I'm kind of mum about it, because we haven't completely signed all the paperwork on it. We will. It's one of the independent companies, so it's one of the smaller companies, but it's something I've wanted to do. One of my friends who's an editor at one of the companies spoke to me about something like that years ago, and it's kind of taken this long to get around to where we were both in a position where that could happen. So I think I'm going to be off the radar for a while as far as having work out there other than maybe reprint work. So with luck, if we get everything done, we'll announce it at San Diego. I'm not going to promise that, but we're trying to get that done. And if that gets squared away, with luck, it'll be out by the next San Diego. But it takes a while to get this stuff squared away. But it's something I really want to do. It'll be something I'll be writing as well as drawing, and I hope it works out. I'm looking forward to it.
Do you have any final messages you'd like to get to the fans out there watching?
Yeah, come to Colossalcon. It's great. We love it here. So, and thanks very much for watching, and go back and buy the Hulk and buy my new comic in a year.
All right, Walter Simonson, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, guys. Take care.